I did not notice anything unusual at first. There was no warning bell, no vague intuition, and certainly no moment when my heart dropped the way people describe in stories. My life at that time followed a predictable orbit, going to work on time, coming home on time, spending weekends on quiet dinners. I believed that a stable marriage did not need to be loud to prove anything. That was why, when I first began to notice their eyes, I blamed myself for overthinking. That evening took place in a familiar setting, the company's year-end party. The lighting was bright enough that no one needed to hide anything, the music soft enough for conversations without whispers. I stood next to my wife, holding a glass of water, listening to work stories I had heard too many times before. Then I saw her turn to look at another man. Not quickly, not nervously, not furtively. Just a look that lasted longer than it needed to. That man was her coworker. I knew his name, his position, even his habit of arriving early and leaving late from the stories my wife told every night. Every time she mentioned him, she used the same phrase, just a coworker. I had no reason to doubt her. At least, not until I saw the way their eyes lingered on each other, as if no further explanation was required. I did not step in. I did not move closer. I only observed. That habit had followed me for years of working with security systems and data. I was used to seeing things as patterns of repeated behavior, small details that never appeared by accident. And in that moment, what caught my attention was not the smile, but the silence between them. A silence that was not awkward or uncomfortable, but instead felt natural. Throughout the rest of the evening, I began to notice details I had never paid attention to before. The way she unconsciously turned her body toward him when she laughed. The way he slightly lowered his head when speaking to her, as if he did not want to miss any subtle reaction. There was no touch. No action crossed the line of social boundaries. But taken together, those details created a very clear feeling. They were in a private space, even while standing among many people. I asked myself whether I was looking for a problem where none existed. I had seen coworkers who were closer than this. I had witnessed friendships that were completely innocent. But what I could not ignore was that their gaze did not look outward to the surrounding world. It was directed at one person only. And eyes like that do not belong to harmless relationships. When the party ended, we went home as usual. There were no arguments, no sudden questions. My wife talked about the evening, about work, about upcoming plans. I listened and responded appropriately. But in my mind, that moment of shared glances kept replaying like a short video clip that would not shut off. I realized I was not angry. I felt unusually clear-headed. That night, lying in the dark room, I understood that what I had seen was not proof and could not yet be called betrayal. It was only a sign. A very small, very subtle signal, but enough to make someone trained to observe stop and take notice. I did not know what I would do next. I only knew that from that moment on, I would never look at my marriage the same way again. Not because I had lost trust, but because I had begun to see things I had previously chosen not to see. I did not say anything to my wife after that party. Not because I was afraid to confront her, but because I did not see the need. What I had seen was not enough to turn into a question, yet too clear to be ignored. I understood that some truths do not appear immediately. They require time to reveal themselves. And time, to me, has always been a precise tool. The days that followed passed normally, at least on the surface. We still had breakfast together, still exchanged small conversations about work and the weather. My wife did not change her behavior, showed no signs of defensiveness or avoidance. That calmness made me pay even closer attention to small details, because I knew that important things are rarely loud. I began to notice her schedule, not to control it, but to compare it. Slightly later finishing times, meetings that lasted a few minutes longer than before. Nothing unusual when viewed individually, but when placed side by side, they formed a familiar pattern. I had seen that pattern before in raw data. Small changes, when accumulated, lead to a clear conclusion. One afternoon, I sat alone in my office, in front of screens filled with security footage I handled every day. I had no intention of monitoring my wife, but I could not deny that the camera system in the office building's parking garage was part of the work I had once helped design. It operated automatically, without emotion, without judgment. And it was precisely that indifference that made it reliable. I opened older footage, without fast-forwarding, without selecting specific moments. I let everything run at its natural pace, the way I always did when searching for a system anomaly. At first, there was nothing but familiar images. Cars coming and going, people walking, lights reflecting on concrete floors. Then I saw her. Not alone, but not with anyone either. A few seconds later, that man appeared in the frame. They did not stand close to each other. They did not exchange overly intimate greetings. At times, they even kept enough distance to avoid drawing attention. But I noticed something the camera recorded very clearly. They stopped. Not because they needed to speak urgently, but because neither of them was in a hurry to leave. They stood there, in silence, looking at each other in the same way I had seen at the party. I watched that footage multiple times, not because I doubted my eyes, but because I wanted to be sure I was not over-interpreting. The camera did not record sound, but it recorded rhythm. The rhythm of breathing, the rhythm of pauses, the spaces between movements. And in those spaces, I saw an intimacy that did not require words. In the days that followed, I continued observing, without changing my daily routines. I did not ask questions. I did not test her reactions. I only collected. Each time I reviewed the footage, I noted the time, the location, the distance. I realized that these moments did not occur randomly. They repeated, with the same person, in the same space. What troubled me most was not the possibility of betrayal, but my own calmness. I did not feel insulted. I did not see myself as a victim. I only saw a truth slowly taking shape, like a photograph developing in a dark room. The longer I looked, the clearer the outlines became. At some point, I understood that I had crossed the boundary of ordinary suspicion. I no longer wondered whether something was happening. I only wondered where it would lead. And in that question, I realized I had begun separating emotion from observation. I was not seeking a confession. I was waiting for the evidence to say what needed to be said on its own. I chose to ask on an ordinary evening, when there was no reason to turn the question into an interrogation. Dinner was finished. The kitchen lights were off. The apartment quiet enough that I could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner. I did not raise my voice, nor did I use accusatory words. I simply said that lately I felt something had changed, and I wanted to know whether I was misunderstanding it. She looked at me, not for too long, and not evasively. That gaze was different from the one I had seen at the party and in the footage. It was direct, prepared, as if the answer had been arranged in advance. She spoke quickly and smoothly, saying that I was stressed from work, that I had overinterpreted ordinary situations. She repeated what I had heard many times before. Just a coworker. I listened without interrupting. I realized her denial was not defensive. It was not chaotic or emotional, but clearly structured. She offered examples, comparisons, and even counter-questions designed to make me doubt myself. If I were not accustomed to analyzing data, I might have believed everything truly existed only in my imagination. I presented no evidence. I did not mention the cameras, nor did I refer to what I had observed. I simply nodded, acknowledging that perhaps I had overthought things. I did this not to avoid conflict, but to keep the conversation true to its nature. Because I understood that when someone believes they have not been discovered, they continue to behave in the most familiar way. In the days that followed, my wife seemed more at ease. She spoke more freely, laughed more often, and even proactively talked about work and that coworker as if there were nothing to hide. That openness, rather than reassuring me, confirmed what I suspected. It was like a thin coating placed over a cracked surface, just enough to obscure the view of someone who did not want to look closely. I continued observing, not only through cameras but also in everyday moments. The way she held her phone when texting, the way she paused mid-sentence when I entered the room. There were no signs of panic, only very small, very subtle adjustments. I realized this was not a spontaneous lie. It was a state maintained long enough to feel natural. What made me think most was the gap between words and behavior. Her words were perfect, consistent, without visible flaws, But behavior was different. It was not wrong in any single moment, but when assembled together, it told a different story. And that story did not need to be spoken to exist. One evening, after she had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the living room, looking at the dark screen of my phone. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the need to prove myself right. I only realized that our marriage had entered a new state, one where truth and words no longer ran in parallel. From that moment, I knew I would not seek a confession. I would let things continue, because I understood that denial can only exist where there is no light. I did not rush into any decision immediately after that conversation. I understood that any hasty conclusion carries emotion, and emotion distorts data. I continued living as before, continued going to work, continued having quiet dinners, as if nothing were changing. But within me, a boundary had been set. From that point on, I no longer sought answers from words, but from what people do when they believe no one is watching. I expanded the scope of my observation, not by following directly, but by looking at what already existed. The camera system in the office building was not designed to catch infidelity. It was designed to record movement. And it was precisely that neutrality that made it impossible to accuse it of bias. I reviewed the footage in chronological order, letting days connect to one another like frames in an unedited film. Gradually, a rhythm emerged. Not every day, but frequently enough that it could not be called random. The same time near the end of the workday, the same area in the parking garage, the same brief pause where neither person was in a hurry to leave. I realized that what mattered was not duration, but repetition. Any system can tolerate error, but when error becomes a rule, it is no longer error. I began storing those recordings systematically. No editing, no cutting, no marking with personal emotion. I simply attached time and location and left everything in its original state. I was not thinking about court when I did this. I was only doing what I always did in my profession, preserving data before it was overwritten or disappeared. During that process, I realized something that sent a chill through me. Their moments together were not impulsive. There were no signs of urgency or immediate desire. Instead, there was familiarity. A kind of intimacy that had been accepted, repeated, and no longer needed to be concealed by clumsy behavior. That made me understand that if this was a mistake, it had lasted long enough to become a habit. I still said nothing to my wife. I saw no need to create a confrontation before reaching a final decision. But my silence began to have an effect. I noticed her occasionally looking at me longer, as if assessing how much I knew. Her questions became more indirect, not anxious, but probing. I did not respond with suspicion. I responded with calm. One evening, as we sat facing each other in the living room, she talked about work in her familiar tone. I looked at her and suddenly realized that in those stories, I was no longer the one being addressed. I was the listener, but no longer the anchor. That awareness did not hurt me. It only helped me clearly identify my position in this relationship. That night, I decided to call a lawyer I knew, not to file a case, but to ask. I did not tell my story with emotion, only with facts. I asked whether a relationship without physical contact, but with repeated and concealed intimacy, could be considered a breach of marital trust. The answer was not direct, but clear enough for me to understand that the legal boundary was not as narrow as many people believe. When I ended the call, I did not feel lighter or heavier. I only knew that I had entered a different phase. From that moment on, this story was no longer purely personal. It had become a sequence of events that could be verified, presented, and evaluated. And I understood that whether I acted or not, the truth already existed independently of anyone's wishes. I did not file for divorce immediately after that call. I understood that a legal decision is not the end of emotion, but the beginning of a different process. I needed to be certain that everything I did afterward would rest on what could withstand scrutiny, not on personal assumptions. So I continued living in the same space, following the same routine, as if everything were still normal. That normalcy had a strange effect. It made others let their guard down. My wife did not change her schedule to avoid anything. She did not erase habits or become more discreet. On the contrary, she behaved like someone who believed everything had already been explained. That confidence created room for the truth to reveal itself without being forced.
I continued reviewing the footage, this time not only to observe but to compare. I compared one day to another, 1 week to the previous one. Similarities appeared with remarkable precision. The same standing angle, the same distance, the same time near the end of the workday. Nothing remarkable if each moment was isolated, but when stacked together, they formed a clear structure. One afternoon I realized I was no longer watching those videos with personal emotion.
I was not searching for proof to convince myself. I was doing the work of someone preparing a file. I marked times, preserved originals, and noted recurring points. Each action was technical, free of judgment. I understood that when data is handled correctly, it speaks for itself.
Meanwhile, our daily life continued in controlled silence.
Conversations became shorter, but not tense. I no longer asked about her work, and she no longer volunteered as much as before. There was an unspoken agreement where both of us avoided touching topics that might expose what had not yet been said aloud.
I began to realize that our relationship had shifted from intimate to parallel.
We existed in the same space, but no longer truly intersected. This awareness did not make me sad. It only reinforced the decision that this marriage had changed in nature, and what remained was largely form.
Once again, I contacted the lawyer, this time to ask about procedure.
I asked about how to collect and preserve evidence, about what is considered acceptable in a civil divorce. I did not use moral language. I asked only about standards and limits. That conversation helped me understand that careful preparation is not an act of revenge, but a form of self-protection.
From that point on, I began categorizing everything. Not only the videos, but also behavioral changes, delays, prolonged silences. I did not record my emotions. I recorded events. I knew that in a legal environment, emotions can be questioned, but events cannot. There were nights when I sat alone, looking at the list of what had been preserved,
and realized that I no longer hoped things would return to how they were. That clarity did not bring pain, but an earlier sense of closure. I stopped asking why, and focused only on what comes next.
By the end of this chapter of my life, I understood that truth does not need to be exposed through accusations.
It only needs to be placed in the right position, at the right time. And I knew that I was moving closer to the moment when everything would no longer remain in silence.
I filed for divorce on an ordinary morning.
Not an anniversary, not after an argument, and not because of a new discovery. It was simply the moment when I had finished preparing everything that needed to be prepared. I understood that in decisions like this, emotion is not a reliable signal. Readiness is the only necessary indicator.
The legal process began slowly, exactly as I had been warned.
Papers were sent out, responses arrived later than expected, and everything moved in a dry, orderly manner. There was no drama, no moral questioning, only procedure. And within that procedure, I realized something. When things are placed into a legal framework, they lose the ability to hurt in the way emotions usually do.
My wife reacted exactly as I had anticipated.
Not with anger, not with panic, but with confusion. She asked for a reason, not in an accusatory tone, but as if searching for a missing detail in the story. I did not offer a long explanation. I simply said that we were no longer standing in the same place. That answer did not satisfy her, but it was honest enough that I did not need to say more. When meetings with lawyers began, I presented everything I had collected for the first time. I did not narrate it emotionally, but chronologically. Each recording, each note, each repetition. I could see the change in the other person's eyes as the pieces gradually formed a complete picture. No one said it was infidelity in the traditional sense, but no one denied that it was intimacy beyond boundaries.
In those discussions, I learned to view my own story from the outside.
No longer a participant, I became a case file. And as a case file, my story did not require sympathy. It required consistency. I realized that thorough preparation not only helped me legally, but also created a necessary distance between me and what had happened.
The first court session did not unfold the way I had imagined.
There was no direct confrontation, no climactic moment. Most of the time was spent verifying information, clarifying procedure, and scheduling the next steps. I sat there, hearing my name called as a legal designation, and realized that I was walking through a door that could not be reopened. What struck me most was the absence of the other man. He was not a party to this case, and therefore did not need to appear. That absence emphasized a cold truth. Responsibility in a marriage cannot be transferred. It belongs to the two people who made the commitment, and no one else. After the session, I left the courthouse alone. No one walked with me, no one waited. I did not feel lonely. I only felt that a phase had officially ended, even though many procedures still lay ahead. That clarity allowed me to remain calm, even knowing that what was coming would not be simple. That night, I sat in the apartment, looking around at familiar objects and understanding that they were about to lose their old meaning. Not because they had changed, but because I had changed the way I saw them. I no longer expected an apology or an admission. I was only waiting for this process to reach its logical conclusion, where everything would be named correctly, and nothing would have to be hidden in silence anymore. The next court session took place on a gray morning, the sky dry but heavy. I arrived early and sat on the bench reserved for the parties involved, hands resting on my knees, back straight. I did not prepare myself for a confrontation because I understood that what mattered most was no longer in words. Once everything enters a case file, people carry only their presence. My wife arrived a few minutes after me. She sat at a distance just enough to avoid contact, but not far enough to avoid sight. In that moment, I realized it was the first time in months that we were in the same space without our familiar roles. No longer husband and wife in daily life. We were simply two sides in a procedure. My lawyer presented the case succinctly. There were no harsh accusations, no judgmental language. Only a timeline, recorded footage, and the repetition of wordless moments. When the videos were played, the room grew quieter than necessary. No one needed sound to understand what was being shown. I looked toward my wife. Her face did not change, but her eyes did. They no longer held the certainty they once had, nor the calm of someone who believes everything can be explained. They were the eyes of someone realizing for the first time that silence, when placed under public light, no longer protects anything. The opposing lawyer attempted to rebut. They spoke of the absence of physical contact, the lack of private messages, the absence of actions recorded as wrongdoing in the conventional sense. I listened without reacting. I had heard those arguments before, and I knew they held weight only when examined in isolation. When placed together, they began to lose their force. The judge requested to see additional footage, not out of doubt, but for consistency. I realized that this moment lacked the drama of films. It unfolded slowly, methodically, leaving no room for emotion. Yet it was precisely that slowness that made everything undeniable. When the session paused, I stood and left the courtroom in silence. No one called after me. No one asked another question. I did not feel victorious. I only felt that what I had seen long ago had finally been seen by others, in a space where denial no longer had a place. Outside, my wife called my name. Her voice was neither loud nor trembling. She asked why I had not spoken sooner, why I had not confronted her directly. I looked at her and realized that the question came from a place no longer relevant to my decision. I told her that some things, if spoken too early, only become arguments. I chose to let the truth reach a point where it no longer needed a defender. We stood there for a few seconds, among strangers passing by. None of them knew who we were, or what had just happened. I realized that this conversation could no longer change the outcome. It was only a final attempt to recover a form of communication that had been lost. When I turned away, I carried no resentment. I carried only the clarity that every gaze that had once been innocent no longer was, and had now been seen for what it truly was. The ruling was delivered not long after. There was no surprise, no reversal. Everything unfolded exactly as the data had indicated from the beginning. I was present in the courtroom when the judge read the conclusion, but it did not feel like the decisive moment. The decisive moment had occurred long before, at the point when I realized that repeated silence is also a form of behavior. I listened as the terms were read, one by one, in a neutral tone. The division of assets, the related procedures, the timelines to be completed. I registered everything the way I always register important information in life, without overreacting, without attaching additional emotional meaning. This was not punishment. This was consequence.
My wife stood a few steps away from me when the session ended. She did not look toward me. I did not seek her gaze either. Not out of avoidance, but because I understood that eyes which had once carried too much meaning were no longer necessary. Everything had been said, even if not through words. When I left the building, the daylight had fully settled in. People continued moving about, unaware that for me, a large part of my life had just closed. I walked slowly, not because of heaviness, but because I no longer had any reason to hurry. There was nothing left to chase, and nothing left to hold on to. The days that followed passed in a new rhythm. I moved into another apartment, smaller, with fewer belongings. The emptiness felt strange at first, but quickly became comfortable. I realized that the silence here was different from the silence before. It hid nothing. It was simply the absence of things that no longer existed. I did not follow news about my former wife, nor did I seek to know where that relationship might lead. It no longer concerned me. Questions like, what if, or if only, did not arise. Not because I lacked memory, but because memory had been placed where it belonged. Behind me. One evening, as I sat alone by the window watching the steady flow of cars below, I thought about the gaze that had started everything. I understood that betrayal rarely begins with an obvious act. It begins when someone allows themselves to look away from what they have committed to, and look towards someone else long enough to forget the boundary. If there is anything I took from this story, it is not a lesson about suspicion, but a lesson about attention. What we choose to notice, what we choose to overlook, eventually shapes our reality. I did not lose a marriage because of what was done in the dark, but because of what was repeated in the light, without being named. I continue my life, not with a sense of victory, but with clarity. I carry no bitterness, and I seek no forgiveness. I carry only a simple understanding. There are gazes that, once turned away, never return. And realizing that sooner or later does not change the outcome, but it determines how we walk forward in the end.